Hello viewers, this is An American Thinks, and this video will be a brief change of pace for me. I'm sure most of you have come to my channel from the videos I've done following the Thousand Worlds Book Club by YouTube user Preston Jacobs. This video will be my first standalone theory video for the World of Ice and Fire, though for added context you may want to review similar theory videos from Preston Jacobs, particularly his Cold Conspiracy series, and from users such as Rawrist and others covering the North Remembers plotline. And also, as we get started, please forgive any minor technical issues that may pop up in this video. I am experimenting with some new hardware and software rather than just talking in front of a webcam, and I'll be working to improve video quality going forward. Now let's start off by talking about everyone's favorite author, George R.R. Martin, and in particular, let's talk about his childhood. If you've watched any George R.R. Martin interviews, he very frequently, and by that I mean almost always, talks about his childhood in Bayonne, New Jersey. And now for those of you who are not familiar, Bayonne is a major port town on the Hudson River, and George R.R. Martin frequently mentions that the public housing project where he grew up was near the docks. His father was also a longshoreman, and he sometimes mentions that his mother's grandfather reportedly built one of the docks in Bayonne. So if there is any fantasy author out there who understands docks, harbors, and the importance of maritime commerce, I'd have to lay a serious bet that it's probably George R.R. Martin. So with that in mind, let's turn to this map of the North, which is available from Quartermaster, and I have a link to the map in the description below if you want to check it out and follow along. Now, full disclosure, I am not related to Quartermaster in any way, but if you are so moved, drop them a couple bucks to help keep the website up, as it is a very handy resource for fans. Now, let's look at this map in the context of trade in a historic or fantasy setting. Now, until modern times, in Earth's history, rivers and oceans were really the only highways of the world. And in fact, even today, water transport still remains the cheapest method of transporting goods available, even despite all of our technological advances. So, in a setting like the World of Ice and Fire, we must assume that water transport would be similarly important. Now, we can see what we would call a continental divide running through the Barrowlands and the Wolf's Wood to the mountains in the far north, with 3 major rivers running southwest towards Blazewater Bay, and 4 major rivers running southeast to the Shivering Sea. Now, out of these 2 broad groups of rivers, I would have to assume that the rivers running southeast are by far more useful for trade than the ones running southwest. The southeasterly rivers can trade along the coast of Westeros all the way to King's Landing, and can also traverse the Shivering Sea or the Narrow Sea to trade with the Free Cities. The southwesterly rivers, on the other hand, don't flow towards any nearby continents at all, and going south, the trade would have to pass by the Iron Islands, and we know that historically, the Iron Men have not been necessarily the best neighbors to have where trade is concerned. So we should be pretty confident in assuming that the vast majority of any trade that comes out of the north comes from the 4 southeasterly rivers. And as of the time of the books, this must be particularly true since the western coast and inland areas of the north have been raided by the Iron Men, and are likely producing nothing of any value at all by this point. So let's take a closer look at these 4 southeasterly rivers, and we're going to begin with the farthest north. This river is called the Last River. And as far as trade is concerned, it does have the advantage of traversing almost the entire width of the continent, and it also has ready access to plentiful wood resources. However, being so far north, the land that surrounds this river would have the shortest growing seasons and the hardest winters compared to the other 3 rivers, and a lot of the land that lies north of the Last River is part of the Gift, and these resources produced here would go to the Night's Watch rather than to trade. The Last River is largely controlled by the Umbers from Last Hearth, although notably, the resources we have available don't come right out and say that it is controlled by the Umbers, and that does lead me to wonder. But let's pause on that for a moment and move to the next river south. This is the Weeping Water, and it is the shortest of the rivers that flow to the southeast, and it doesn't appear to be near any major resources. The Weeping Water is controlled by House Bolton from the Dreadfort, and I suspect that the Boltons likely control the mouth of the last river as well. You can see on the map that the mouth of this river lies much closer to the Dreadfort than it does to Last Hearth, and it shares this bay with the Weeping Water. And even if the Boltons do not control the mouth of the last river outright, they almost certainly assert more influence over trade along the last river than the Umbers would necessarily like. And moving south again, the next river is the Broken Branch. This is also a relatively short river, but we can see that it flows out of the Hornwood, so it does have access to timber resources, and it lies substantially farther south than these first two rivers that we've discussed. This is also the first river that we come across that has a town and a castle near the mouth of the river, Ramsgate. And I think this is notable. As I said previously, I think George R. R. Martin is well aware of the effects of maritime trade, and to have these first two rivers with no notable towns at the mouths of the rivers, at least none substantial enough to mark on a map, and now to find one that does, I think that speaks quite directly regarding the volume of trade that is flowing out of these various rivers. Now, moving on, the last of the four southeasterly rivers is the White Knife. And it is no secret that the White Knife is the source of a lot of trade in the north, and that the Manderlys, who are located at White Harbor at the mouth of the White Knife, have benefited substantially from trade along the river. As we know that the Manderlys are the wealthiest noble family in the north, except for possibly the Starks. The White Knife is the most southerly of all the rivers, so the land that is around it has the longest growing seasons and the mildest winters compared to the other three rivers. And it also flows in the most southerly direction, which is the direction you would want to go if you intended to take goods to virtually any worthwhile market outside of the north. And if you follow the White Knife north, it goes almost directly to Winterfell, which is likely the biggest importer of outside goods in all of the north. And if you study this map of the north in a broader sense, you'll see that if you were in the north and you wanted to send your goods to one of these southeasterly rivers, you would have to cross over the White Knife in order to reach any of the other three rivers, unless you lived right next to one of them. So we can conclude that by a wide margin, the White Knife is certainly the most valuable of the four southeasterly rivers to control. So why is all this geography important? Do these rivers affect the politics of the North and the story of A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, let's go back to the Broken Branch for a moment. You probably noticed that I did not yet discuss who controls the Broken Branch. Control of the Broken Branch has historically been split between House Hornwood, who control the land surrounding the source of the Broken Branch, and with Ramsgate at the mouth of the river. Now, we have precious little information about Ramsgate, but we do know that it is controlled by House Manderly. So control of this river was historically shared between House Hornwood in the north and House Manderly in the south. And now remember that one time when Hallis Hornwood was killed in the Battle of the Green Fork, and then his son was killed in the Battle of the Whispering Wood, leaving House Hornwood without an heir? And then all these northern lords, and in particular the Manderlys and the Boltons, suddenly wanted to marry Donella Hornwood? Well, it wasn't because they suddenly all had MILF fetishes. As it turns out, they all had river fetishes. If Lord Manderly were to marry Lady Hornwood, he would have control of not only the White Knife, but the Broken Branch as well, the two most important of these southeasterly rivers for trade. And if the Boltons could marry her, they would finally have control of a piece of a river that was worth having. Remember, the Boltons control the shortest river, and also apparently the one with the least resources. So it should be no surprise that Ramsay Bolton kidnapped Lady Hornwood, and it should also be no surprise that in turn Lord Manderly immediately sent his men to take control of Hornwood lands. Now, we should note that Wyman Manderly makes a suggestion to Robb Stark when he is King of the North, and he suggests that he should have his own coins, and that White Harbor is the very place to mint them. There is, of course, plenty of reason why White Harbor would be a logical choice, since most of the trade in the north flows through there. And from a prestige standpoint, there is a lot of reason for a king to have his own coins, but economically, there isn't any particular benefit to doing trade in one form of coin or another. In fact, minting coins costs money. You have to pay an engraver to make a new coin design. Then you have to pay someone for their gold, melt it down, stamp it, and let it cool, and then sell it again. And an ounce of gold is still only worth an ounce of gold, no matter what shape the ounce of gold happens to be in. And the problem becomes worse with coins of more common metals, as these have higher melting points than does gold and require more energy to melt. However, there is a notable economic benefit to the person in charge of minting the coins. In Earth's history, native coins are almost always exchanged for foreign coins at an advantageous exchange rate that produces a profit for the person distributing the native coin. So, not only would Wyman Manderly have a near monopoly on northern trade, he would also have a monopoly on northern coin as well, which would produce an extremely powerful combination for economic dominance of the North. So in this context, I think I can almost forgive Roose Bolton for turning on the Starks. And that's not that I'm saying that Roose is a good guy or has any measurable redeeming qualities, or that this is the only compelling reason for him to turn traitor. But we have to admit, the Boltons have been getting the short end of the economic stick in the North for apparently a long time, which is admittedly what you would expect of a house that is generally not trustworthy and historically used to make war on the Starks. But with this pendulum looking to swing even further toward the Manderly's direction, I think Roose probably concluded he didn't have a lot of options left. He either had to accept a new status quo, with the northern economy being even more dominated by the Manderlys, or he had to find a new liege with enough coin to compete with the Manderlys and good reason to put the Boltons in a position of power. Someone like the Lannisters. And notably, when Roose Bolton flips on the Starks and makes his power play in the north, he forces Wyman Manderly to concede that the Hornwood lands now belong to the Boltons. So, where do I think all of this is going? Let's press rewind a little bit and touch on a few clues that we've skipped over. In A Clash of Kings, Wyman Manderly shows up at Winterfell for the Harvest Feast. This is when he offers to mint coins for Robb, but he also offers to build the Starks a fleet of war galleys. We then witness a conversation between Sir Roderick and the Umbers, discussing wildling raids, and Sir Roderick says, "You have forests of tall pine and old oak. Lord Manderly has shipwrights and sailors in plenty. Together you ought to be able to float enough longships to guard both your coasts." "Manderly," Mors Umbers snorted. "That great waddling sack of suet. His own people mock him as Lord Lamprey, I've heard. The man can scarce walk. If you stuck a sword in his belly, 10,000 eels would wriggle out." "He is fat," Sir Roderick admitted, "but he is not stupid. You will work with him, or the king will know the reason why." And to Bronn's astonishment, the truculent Umbers agreed to do as he commanded, though not without grumbling. Now, after this event, we can fast forward a little bit to A Dance with Dragons, where we find poor Davos Seaworth bumbling about on his diplomatic mission to White Harbor. He takes in some sights, enjoys the local ambiance, and then presents himself to Wyman Manderly to soon be imprisoned. But not before he notices that there are 23 war galleys being built in the harbor. I take this as a sign that there has indeed been an Umber-Manderly alliance. With the Karstarks angry at just about everyone, and the Boltons and Manderlys fighting in the Hornwood, and the Ironborn and then the Boltons in control of Winterfell, the only major source of timber available to the Manderlys would be from the Umbers. However, we should not neglect that Sir Roderick intended for the Manderlys to build longboats to guard the coasts, ostensibly to defend against wildlings. However, the Manderlys have been building war galleys, a vastly different type of boat used for naval warfare, not for coastal or brown water patrolling. So, if we take stock of the North, I see that it sits like this. The Umbers don't like the Boltons, because the Boltons interfere with what little trade comes up the last river, and because they turned on the Starks, and because they're, well, Boltons. And the Umbers already have a functioning alliance with House Manderly for shipbuilding. Meanwhile, the Manderlys don't like the Boltons because of the issue of House Hornwood, and because they turned on the Starks, and because they're, well, Boltons. So I have to think that the Umbers and the Manderlys are planning to squeeze the Boltons between them and wipe them out of the North altogether. And once that is finished, House Manderly will have control not only of the White Knife, but the Broken Branch through Ramsgate and Hornwood, and of the Weeping Water, because the Boltons will be wiped out, and the last river indirectly through their alliance with the Umbers. They will absolutely dominate the economy of the North, with no single rival, or even a likely combination of rivals, coming remotely close to their economic power. And furthermore, with 23 new war galleys, they are going to be one of the most formidable naval powers remaining in Westeros, with none of their northern rivals being able to come remotely close to challenging their naval power either. Remember that both Stannis and the Lannisters each only have about 10 war galleys that managed to survive the Battle of the Blackwater. So Wyman Manderly is about to become the biggest power broker in the North, as well as a major power player in Westeros anywhere naval force or maritime trade is concerned. Now the biggest question is, what is Wyman Manderly likely to do with all of this power? Well, we would like to hope that he'd take his ships to Skagos and find Rickon Stark and sail up the White Knife to Winterfell, crown Rickon King of the North, rebuild Winterfell, and tell everyone that they're going to live happily ever after. The thing is, this is George R. Martin writing the story, so I don't think we're going to get everything wrapped up in such a nice, tidy package. So let's take a look at the available options. Do I think Wyman Manderly would claim power for himself? Well, honestly, I'll just come right out and say it. I kind of doubt it. And not because I think Wyman Manderly is such a loyal, magnanimous subject of House Stark. But I do think that Wyman Manderly is a man who's very aware of his own shortcomings. Namely, I think he's well aware that he has virtually no right to rule in the North. And he is also aware that his persona of a fat man doesn't cause anyone to respect him very much. And I also think that he is aware that the Umbers have worked with him not so much because they like him, but because they shared a common enemy. And he also doesn't appear to have any significant relationship with the Reeds, and anybody who wants to be king of the North has to have the Reeds willing to defend the neck against a land invasion. And when you add all these things up, I have to conclude that Wyman Manderly just is not planning to control the North outright. Rather, I think he is planning to be the power propping up a Stark with an ostensible right to rule. So what Wyman Manderly should logically do is figure out which Starks are remaining and who his powers best combine with, and work to put those people into power. Now, Wyman Manderly knows about Rickon Stark on Skagos. But Rickon can't really make use of what Wyman Manderly has to offer other than to fill a vacant throne in Winterfell and let Wyman Manderly be his regent for 15-odd years until he can rule on his own. Not necessarily a bad plan, but it has actually quite a few holes that would need to be taken care of, the biggest one of which, I think, is this guy named Stannis Baratheon, who keeps running around the North trying to be king. So perhaps Stannis Baratheon would agree to let Rickon be king of the North under Stannis? Well, possibly, but why would Stannis want Wyman Manderly to be Rickon's regent? That's an awful lot of power to hand someone without anything in return. Well, perhaps if Wyman Manderly made a secret deal with Stannis' hand, one Davos Seaworth, to retrieve Rickon Stark, and in exchange for Rickon, Wyman Manderly would swear fealty to Stannis. Obviously, Stannis could use Manderly's warships, but more importantly, I think, Stannis will need Manderly's wealth, since Stannis has recently made a deal with the Iron Bank of Braavos, who want to be repaid for the immense debts racked up by Stannis' brother, the former King Robert Baratheon. This works out to be a pleasant resolution to the Mexican standoff, where Rickon needs a rescuer, Wyman Manderly needs a Stark, and Stannis needs money and warships. But what if there was an alternative? We know that Peter Baelish has another Stark in hand, in this case Sansa Stark, and Preston Jacobs presents some very compelling evidence that Peter Baelish also has schemes with Braavos. And in the TV adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire, Sansa was sent to Winterfell to wed Ramsay Bolton, suggesting that Sansa might become involved in the North somehow in the upcoming book. Could Manderly be convinced to work with Peter Baelish in order to put Sansa on the throne of Winterfell and open the economies of both the North and the Vale to the Iron Bank, with Baelish and Manderly holding the true power in their respective regions? I would say it's not outside the realm of possibility, although admittedly there is less evidence of this plot in the books. Or a very powerful group in Braavos has yet another Stark in hand, in this case Arya Stark. And it just so happens that a pro-dragon political faction in Braavos appears ready to take over the reins of the city. Could Manderly be convinced to prop up Arya Stark as a ruler, possibly underneath Daenerys Targaryen or a not-so-dead Aegon Targaryen? I would guess that this is less likely, but still anything is possible. Currently, the bulk of the evidence we have available seems to support a Rickon Stannis Manderly alliance. But with as much power as Wyman Manderly is about to have, he could support whoever the hell he wants to, and there's very little that anyone else involved could do to stop him. I do think it's very telling that Wyman Manderly was able to convince the cunning ruse Bolton that he had even an ounce of intent to support the Bolton cause. I also think it's very telling that Wyman Manderly had the foresight to watch his diet. And by that I mean Manderly plays to his strengths of being smart and being rich. But these strengths only work so long as you don't have to go to war. War puts men like Manderly out of their element. Peter Baelish learned this lesson the hard way by challenging Brandon Stark to a duel, and ever after that he stayed away from fighting and played to his strengths. Characters such as Varys also stay away from war and play to similar strengths. But Wyman Manderly is a noble lord. Going to war is a duty expected of noble lords, unless they're too fat to sit a horse. Then they can stay at home biding their time and plotting their moves. That's all for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. And whenever I get the time, I plan to do another theory video, and the topic for that one will be the others. Thanks for watching, and please leave your thoughts in the comments below.